I understand for some of you, maybe, especially some of your colleagues, the hair of the dog wake-up call is a little harder. My name is Yoram Bauman. I appear before you this morning, ladies and gentlemen, as the world's first and only stand-up economist. It's a niche market. I really only have one thing going for me as a stand-up economist, and that's low expectations. Actually, that's not true. I have one other thing going for me as a stand-up economist. I get to make fun of macroeconomists. You know I'm a real economist because I can poke fun at sub-disciplines that are totally indistinguishable to people on the outside. You know, like people in Washington State where I live make fun of people in Oregon, and people in Alabama make fun of people in Mississippi, and people in prison make fun of people in graduate school. I did go through 5 years of graduate school. I got my PhD in economics only to decide that I wanted to do stand-up comedy. You can imagine how much this thrilled my father. He told me I'd never make it as a stand-up economist, and I said, why not? And he said, because there's no demand. That was the first joke I ever made. I said, don't worry, Dad, I'm a supply-side economist. I just stand up and let the jokes trickle down. I believe in the Laffer curve. Thank you, one person. Appreciate that. I should show you my t-shirt before I go any further. It's my Enjoy Capitalism t-shirts. Made in China. If you look at the tag, it's actually 80% cotton and 20% irony. I was in China. I lived there for about 5 months a couple of years ago. I want to show you the place where I lived in Beijing. This is the view from my apartment window. I lived in a housing complex in Beijing that houses 400,000 people. And I was one of 2 non-Chinese people who lived there. It was me and the guy that everybody there referred to as the black guy. And one day I was walking down the street outside my apartment complex and I saw a black guy. So I walked up to him and I was like, you must be, and before I could say anything, he looked at me and he was like, you must be the white guy. And sure enough, it was the black guy. He was from Ghana. He was there on a scholarship doing international trade. Super nice guy. We went to McDonald's. We had lunch. International sign of friendship. In any case, this is the view from my apartment window. About 5% of the time it looked like this. Much more often, of course, the view from my apartment window looked like that. Yeah, so still some pretty serious pollution problems in China. Everybody in China knows that China owns like $3 trillion in US government debt. They don't necessarily understand what that means, though. I had one fellow there who insisted to me that America is a loan shark. And I was like, that is exactly backwards, right? Like, America's not a loan shark. America's like a borrowing walrus. You know, we're just like floating in a sea of our own treasury debt. And this guy in China was like, don't talk to me about treasury debt. You know, it's lousy. And here in China, we're pissed off that you sold us that treasury debt. And I said, you know, that's kind of interesting because in America, we're pissed off that you bought it. Now, I'd just like to point out that this is actually the opposite of the way that economics is supposed to work, right? You're supposed to get mutual benefits from trade, and to end up in a situation where you have voluntary transactions between 2 parties and both of them are unhappy, like, that actually takes a considerable amount of effort. Anyway, I apologized to the fellow in China. I said I was sorry on behalf of, you know, my entire country. And I said that if I could go back in time, I would have encouraged China to invest that money somewhere else, like Greece. People often wonder how I got started doing stand-up comedy about economics, as if it is not the most natural thing in the whole world. I got started with this next little bit that I want to do for you. So this is Mankiw's Principles of Economics Translated. So Greg Mankiw, Harvard professor, wrote one of the best-selling economics textbooks in the country and, in fact, in the world. And it's based on these 10 principles of economics. Now, I know it's early in the morning. I know there's a lot on the screen. But I generally encourage folks not to try to read these. Just take my word that you pretty much need a PhD in economics to understand these 10 principles. Unfortunately, I have a PhD in economics. So I've taken it upon myself to translate these principles for the more fortunate in the world. We're going to begin by separating them into the first 7 principles, which are microeconomics, and the last three, which are macroeconomics. The difference, as P.J. O'Rourke once said, being that microeconomists are wrong about little things, right? And macroeconomists are wrong about things in general. Now we're going to start with the macro principles 8, 9, and 10. Now, believe it or not, these all have the exact same translation, namely blah, blah, blah. I can see that some of you have studied macroeconomics. As proof, I need only remind you that macroeconomists have successfully predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions. And as further proof, we can now go up 1 font size. So let's go back to the microeconomics principles. Now the first one, people face trade-offs. This is really kind of a fundamental idea in economics, and the translation is very simple. Choices are bad. Okay, this is actually a syllogism. Trade-offs are bad. Anytime you have choices, you have trade-offs. Therefore, choices have to be bad. If you don't understand that, take a look at the second principle. The cost of something is what you give up to get it. Translation, choices are really bad. Now, I have a little demonstration of this fact. Let's say that someone offers you a Snickers bar, right, that you value at $1. Okay, and then what you can loosely think of as your economic profit in this situation is the dollar of the Snickers bar minus the cost of what you give up to get it, which is nothing. Your economic profit is $1. Now, to begin to see why choices are bad, imagine someone offers you a choice between the Snickers bar that you value at $1 and some M&Ms that you value at 70 cents. Now your economic profit is $1 minus the 70 cents, only 30 cents. You begin to understand why choices are bad. The worst possible situation, in fact, is being offered a choice between a Snickers bar and an identical Snickers bar, because then your economic profit is 0. Now, people who are not trained in economics might say that that's no different than just being offered one Snickers bar. Okay, but that kind of sloppy thinking will never get you a tenure track position. Summarizing, choices are bad, choices are really bad. I'm not going to beat around the bush with you folks. If you don't understand why choices are bad, you're probably stupid. Moving on, principle number 3, rational people think at the margin. Translation, people are stupid. Now it is immediately obvious that people do not think at the margin. Nobody goes to the grocery store and says, I'm going to buy an orange. I'm going to buy another orange. I'm going to buy another orange. That joke only makes sense to econ majors. People don't think like that. Okay, but if people don't think at the margin, and if, as Mankiw says, rational people do think at the margin, we are led to a most unhappy conclusion. People are not rational. People, in other words, are stupid. But before you despair for humanity, take a look at the next principle. People respond to incentives. Now, the dictionary says that incentives is a noun. That's a synonym for motive. So when Mankiw says that people respond to incentives, what he's saying is that people are motivated by motives. Now, you may think this is a bit like saying that tautologies are tautological, right? I mean, people would have to be pretty stupid to be unmotivated by motives. But remember principle 3, right? People are stupid. Hence the need for principle 4 to tell us that people aren't that stupid. All right, simplifying again, move on to every economist's favorite topic, free trade. Principle 5, trade can make everyone better off. Translation, trade can make everyone worse off. Now you may wonder how the translation of principle 5 is the opposite of the principle itself. I have a simple proof of this fact that will blow your mind. I want you to compare 2 statements. One of them is trade can make everyone better off, and the other one is trade will make everyone better off. Now if you had to pick one of those 2 statements to put in your best-selling economics textbook, right, it's no contest. The second statement is clearly stronger. But Mankiw uses the first statement instead. And if you think about why, there's only one possible explanation. The second statement has got to be wrong. In other words, trade can make some people worse off, and from there it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to trade can make everyone worse off. Now I figured some of you would have some questions about this, so I added a footnote with some details. Eat your heart out. Now that we've cleared that up, I want you to see that the last 2 principles, markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Translation, governments are stupid. And governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. Governments aren't that stupid. Follow immediately from principle 5 and its translation. All right, if trade can make everyone better off, then what the heck do we need government for? Just let people trade. All right, governments are stupid. But if trade can make everyone worse off, then we better have a government around to stop people from trading. So there are the 10 principles of economics translated. Much better, I hope you'll agree. Now, I filmed this a couple of years ago and put a video up on my website and on YouTube, not thinking all that much of it. And I'm a little embarrassed to say that it just passed 1 million hits on YouTube, which is a lot for economics jokes. Not a lot necessarily for videos about, like, puppies or Korean pop stars. But it's a lot for economics jokes, and many of those hits are because the video was posted on Greg Mankiw's blog. It turns out that he's a fan of my parody. Either that or else he comes from the school of there's no such thing as bad publicity. And in fact, I got to perform in his class at Harvard. It was the last leg of my 2008 Supply Side World Tour, which was mostly a trip to Israel with my father. But as long as I was there, I actually did some comedy in Israel. I actually did a little bit of comedy in Europe. I did a show in Switzerland for the Bank for International Settlements, and when I told my wife that I was doing a show at a Swiss bank, she got very excited because she thought it was going to be extremely lucrative. And I had to tell her, well, it's not that kind of Swiss bank. And she said, well, what kind of a Swiss bank is it? And I said, well, it's the kind of Swiss bank that doesn't have very much money. And she said, oh, you're doing a show at UBS. This was years ago. I've talked with the folks who are here from UBS. Apparently UBS is doing much better. I'm very happy about that. In any case, one of the great things about YouTube is that not only do a lot of people, oh, excuse me, I had to finish the story about Harvard. So when I went and did this show at Harvard, he wasn't going to tell his students that I was coming. He just said there was a surprise guest who was coming to class. But then he had to tell them that I was coming because some students went to his office hours and said there was a rumor going around the Harvard campus that Ben Bernanke was coming to class. I'd like to think they got the better end of the deal. In any case, not only do a lot of folks on YouTube waste a lot of time looking at videos on YouTube, a significant fraction of those people waste even more time commenting on videos on YouTube. And I want to share with you some of my favorites because these are actually funnier than the video itself now. So starting with someone with the screen name of Coolway. And Coolway writes, I can't tell whether this video is supposed to be funny or educational. Choices are bad. And people are stupid. Runner-up comment is this one, you're funny. And I don't say that to a lot of people. Lots of people are not funny. Lots of people are sad. I like to think that I'm doing something new in the world by doing stand-up comedy about economics. Apparently not. The next person writes, a Jew who's an economist and a stand-up comedian? You can't get any more stereotypical than that. Every time I see this, I'm reminded what my father actually said when I told him that I was going to do stand-up comedy. So what you need to know about my father's a first-generation American. He's sort of divorced from popular culture like he's never owned a television. And so when I told him I was going to do stand-up comedy, he said, Yoram, he said, be reasonable. You know, give me the name of a single Jew who's ever made it in stand-up comedy. Sometimes people come up to me after my talks and they're really mad and they're like, what about Seinfeld? And I'm like, I know. Tell my father. And my father will say, who's Seinfeld? The other thing this reminds me of, I did a show a couple of years ago in northern Michigan. There's a little resort. I spent the night. I had breakfast at the restaurant, and there was an item on the breakfast menu called the L'Chaim Breakfast Bagel. And the L'Chaim Breakfast Bagel in Thompsonville, Michigan came with your choice of smoked ham. You know what's coming next, smoked ham or crispy bacon. Apparently no Jews in northern Michigan. The man in the video is the most stupid man in the world. Extremely impressive given the competition. Not everybody's a fan of the video. The next person writes, I spaced off listening to this just like in my real economics class. And then there are the crazy people, like this next person who writes, they make economics boring and confusing because they don't want you to figure out that the whole economy is a Ponzi scheme. This person gets bonus points for creating a new word, unpurpose. Maybe you have a purpose, but you have an unpurpose. And this is not the craziest thing that somebody wrote. The craziest thing somebody wrote was this. What a confusion of deceptions. The U.S. Congress does not print money as the Constitution dictates. That power was usurped by a cabal of international banksters in 1913. I know. I spent a fair amount of time trying to figure out whether banksters was a typo. And then my wife informed me that banksters equals bankers plus gangsters. Okay, this is the financial mafia. You've got the Italian mafia that make you offers that you can't refuse, and you've got the financial mafia that make you offers that you can't understand. I finally understood this person was talking about the Federal Reserve Bank, the central bank of the United States, which was created in 1913, but only because the next thing that they write is that the Federal Reserve is about as Federal Express. I honestly have no idea what that means, but I'm pretty sure this guy voted for Ron Paul. So after this guy writes this nasty stuff about the Federal Reserve on my YouTube comments page, somebody else feels compelled to come to the defense of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States on my YouTube comments page. So here's what the next person writes. In defense of the Fed, if we got rid of it, we'd still need to replace it with something that does its functions, i.e. printing money and clearing checks. Okay, the first of which, printing money, the Fed doesn't do. The Treasury prints money. Clearing checks is a very minor role that the Fed has. So somebody else has to write in and correct this person and say, actually, the Fed doesn't print money, and this is like an A+ answer. The Fed controls the money supply by expanding and contracting bank reserves. And then the first person writes back in and says, oh yeah, that's right, thanks. So now we're getting like edumacation on the YouTube comments page, which is always nice to see. Not all exchanges are this nice. One person just writes in and says, translate? So somebody takes the bait and says, he's poking fun at microeconomics. And the first person writes back and says, yeah, but translate, you jerk. The second person writes back and says, that was a translation. You should probably stick to entertaining yourself with less intellectually demanding material. Not the meanest exchange on YouTube. The meanest exchange on YouTube starts with somebody who writes, this video rules. By the way, I'm not an economist. I switched my major. Which compels somebody else to write in and say, thanks for keeping us updated. Let us know when you drop out altogether and devote your life to smoking crack. Kids these days. I want to go back to this slide here. I'm going to be serious for a couple of minutes, and then I will go back to telling you jokes, but this example in this footnote is actually a real example. It actually is possible in a very made-up economics model sort of way to have a situation where trade makes everyone worse off. Usually in economics, of course, we talk about trade making lots of people, often everybody, better off, but the opposite is possible. And since this relates to the work, when I do serious economics, I work on climate change, environmental economics, carbon taxes, things like that. So I just want to talk you through this example real quick. So bear with me for a few minutes, and then we'll go back to telling you jokes. So made up story about these three people. We're just going to call them Orange, Pink, and Blue. Orange, Pink, and Blue live in a small town. The small town has an air pollution problem, so think Beijing, but with three people. And maybe these people are all Americans or something. They each have a garage that's full of stuff that they don't use. So now we're going to see some trades. So first, Orange is going to sell a lawnmower to Pink. We can imagine that they each got $100 in value from that trade. Orange sells a lawnmower that was sitting in her garage unused. She sells it for $100. Pink would be willing to pay $200. She only has to pay $100, so she gets $100 in net benefits. But when Pink starts using that lawnmower, lawnmowers create a little bit of air pollution. Maybe you can see a little bit of haze around this town. Like I said, made up economic story. Maybe we can monetize the health impacts of that air pollution, maybe at $80 per person. Right, not just for Orange and Pink, but also for Blue. So the impact on Blue is what economists call a negative externality. But note that Orange and Pink each get $20 in net benefits, so that trade still makes sense to them. They may not know about Blue, they may not care about Blue. So now I'll tell you a similar story. Pink is going to sell a motorcycle to Blue. Again, they each get $100 in benefits. Pink sells a motorcycle that was sitting in her garage for $100. Blue would be willing to pay $200. She only has to pay $100, so she gets $100 in net benefits. But motorcycles also create some air pollution, maybe an additional $80 in healthcare costs for everybody. And now you just complete the circle. So Blue is going to sell a chainsaw to Orange. I don't know why. They each get $100 in benefits. The air pollution gets worse. Another $80 in healthcare costs for everybody. Right now, if you just add up any one of these columns, you see that after all three of those trades together, everybody ends up at minus 40. I do a lot of shows at colleges, and I get all sorts of answers to that question, like 0, -100. Math is hard. -40, right? So this is the tragedy of the commons or the prisoner's dilemma, if you're familiar with those concepts. But the economics is that each person's trades are individually rational. If you ask any of those people if they want to take back any of the trades that they made, they'll say no, because each trade they make leaves them $20 better off. But altogether, the trades end up hurting everybody. If you want to belabor the point and make a connection to climate change, you could, I don't know, like label the people. And this is in very broad strokes what economists are concerned about when it comes to climate change. Everything that you need to know about climate change in a couple of slides, and then I will go back to telling you jokes. First of all, we have this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up. Nobody doubts this. Nobody doubts this is primarily caused by human activity, burning fossil fuels, and deforestation. Then we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. This theory actually predates Al Gore. It goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who was a chemist in Sweden. And in 1896, he made the first estimate of how much temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896, about 5 degrees Celsius, is still pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome, because he lived in Sweden. And we tend to be a little more concerned about what the impacts might be of sort of changing the basic functionings of planet Earth. In any case, we've been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so, and here are the results of the experiment. The blue dots are individual years, the red bars are 10-year average temperatures going up through the 1970s, and there's the 1980s, and there's the 1990s, and there's the 2000s. For what it's worth, there's the first couple years of this decade. Temperatures going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. If you happen to not believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, I will try to find common ground with you anyway. And the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation and innovation and the development of new technologies and all the things that I at least love about capitalism. So what I work on as an environmental economist is sort of using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. A couple of policy tools to talk about, like a carbon tax, an auction cap and trade system, right? But the point of those policy tools is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. Now this is generally the part of my talk where people stop laughing, because it's hard to convince people that we should be paying more for fossil fuels. But there is a side benefit to doing these policies, other than, you know, like potentially saving the planet. And the side benefit is that if you do these policies right, you generate a pile of revenue. And the government can do all sorts of stuff with that revenue. I'm sure you all have your own ideas about what the government can do with a pile of revenue. But the idea that I work on and talk to folks about is that we could be using most or all of that revenue to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So it's called environmental tax reform or tax shifting. And the economic idea is that we should be taxing things we want less of, like carbon emissions, instead of taxing things we want more of, like jobs and income and investment and savings. And this is where I actually find common ground, even with folks who don't believe in climate change. So George Will came to one of my classes. George Will is a very conservative columnist for the Washington Post. He doesn't believe humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, but I asked him if he would support replacing the payroll tax, the employment tax in the US, in part with a carbon tax, and he said that he was all for it, right? Because he hates the payroll tax. And with unemployment at 7.5%, 8% in the US, I hate the payroll tax. Right? And Al Gore hates the payroll tax. Al Gore says we should tax what we earn and not what we burn. Excuse me, we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. So I asked George Will what he thought about the fact that he and Al Gore agreed on this particular issue. And George Will said, well, he said, an idea should not be held responsible for the people who believe in it. In any case, certainly economists kind of across the political spectrum think this is a fine idea. And there's even a place that's done this. So I live in Seattle, and to my north, the Canadian province of British Columbia has actually implemented a revenue-neutral carbon tax. What I and many other economists consider to be the best climate policy in the world. All the money that comes in from the carbon tax is used to reduce personal and corporate income taxes in the province of British Columbia. There's an offset for low-income households. Really a terrific policy, and they now have the lowest personal income tax rates in Canada, the lowest corporate income tax rates in the G8 group of rich democracies. Really a great policy. So I like to tell folks about this because I think climate change is an important issue that's going to be coming in the decades ahead, and I think economics can be part of the solution to that. And now I will go back to telling you jokes, so thank you for bearing with me. Although I did this once for a very conservative crowd in Minnesota, and this fellow came up to me at the end of my talk and said that the stuff I said about climate change was the funniest part of my whole routine. It has been a big year for economics comedy, ladies and gentlemen. I got to be on the PBS Newshour with Jim Lehrer. Now, I don't know how much you all know about the world of stand-up comedy in the U.S., but let me just tell you this. In the world of stand-up comedy, ladies and gentlemen, it does not get any bigger than the PBS Newshour with Jim Lehrer. It was pretty amazing. They actually interviewed 3 economists on this show. They interviewed Ken Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize. They interviewed Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize. And they interviewed me. I felt like kind of a self-aware version of Sarah Palin. And what did they ask me? My moment of TV fame on the PBS NewsHour? They asked me if I'd ever bombed on stage. Right, now, a couple of things about this, all right? First of all, I am not afraid of failure. I'm an economist. Secondly, I'm a professional comedian, right? So if a joke doesn't work, you just sort of keep throwing stuff out there until you find something that sticks. Which is basically the same thing that the Fed and the Treasury have been doing for the last few years. Finally, I had to admit on the PBS NewsHour that in fact I had bombed on stage. The worst show I ever did was in October of 2008. At the height of the financial crisis, the stock market had tanked. It looked like we were going back into the Great Depression. October of 2008, I did a show in Colorado Springs for a group of bankers. And they were not happy campers. And comedy is kind of a violent business. You know, if you're doing well, then you're killing. If you're doing poorly, then you're bombing. And I totally bombed that show, and I actually spent a fair amount of time afterwards sort of soul-searching, like trying to figure out where had I lost the connection with this audience of bankers in Colorado Springs in October of 2008. And I finally realized that I lost them on my opening line, and my opening line was, "Hey, how's it going?" Apparently it wasn't going very well. I have since then done a number of other shows for banks and financial institutions, and they have gone much better. Especially because I have learned an important lesson. I have learned to get paid in advance. Because you never know whether the bank is going to be there for you tomorrow. I did one show a couple of months ago for another financial institution. I'm not allowed to tell you which bank it was because I signed a non-disclosure agreement. And let me just tell you that in order to figure out which bank it is, it wouldn't be, well, so far to go. And I was talking to him ahead of time. I was like, look, you got to pay me in advance. And the guy, I'm not making this up, the guy said to me, he said, "Do you take credit cards?" I was like, wow, the bank wants to pay me with a credit card. Like, unbelievable. Some other recent news in economics comedy. I like to think of some of what I do as part of a renaissance in economics humor. The idea of a renaissance in economics humor probably comes as a surprise to those of you who know that renaissance means rebirth. And I had no idea that there was ever a first birth of economics humor. But in fact there was. It was in the 70s and the early 80s. It included papers like Paul Krugman's Theory of Interstellar Trade, which if you're into science fiction, I highly recommend. Another paper from this time period is this one, Life Among the Econ by Axel Unpronounceable. I'll tell you about some more recent economics humor papers. So this sign, Obama equals Keynesian. Right, Keynesian economics being the idea going back to John Maynard Keynes that you can use fiscal and monetary policy like a stimulus to get out of a recession. So somebody showed up at a left-wing rally in Washington, D.C. with this sign that said Obama equals Keynesian, ? And then took all these videos of left-wingers coming up to them and being really mad, right, and saying like, that is ridiculous, like his birth certificate is on file in Hawaii. He is not Kenyan. Another good piece of economics humor is this paper. This is a real economics paper. It's called Can Financial Innovation Help to Explain the Reduced Volatility of Economic Activity? One of the co-authors here, Doug Elmendorf, is the head of the Congressional Budget Office in the U.S. Now, one of the interesting things about this paper, of course, is that it was published in 2006, shortly before financial innovation led to the greatest increase in the volatility of economic activity since the Great Depression. Now, you may think this bodes ill for the research that was done by these scholars, but in fact it's okay. I have tracked down the abstract of this paper, and here's the abstract of the paper. No. I should mention I've got a couple of cartoon economics books. I'm working on a cartoon climate change book. You can get these on my website, standupeconomist.com, or from Amazon. I'm happy to say economists have said nice things about it. So Greg Mankiw called it a painless way to learn economics, which I thought was especially generous coming from Greg Mankiw, given what I said about his book. I mean, I really think the only thing that I could have done that would have been meaner to Greg Mankiw would have been to post something on my blog calling his book a painful way to learn economics. Which I didn't do, but still. There's how to get a hold of me. I encourage you to give me a business card or get on my website and sign up for my email list. I won't spam you, but I'll let you know when I have new videos or shows coming up. For instance, every year I run the humor session at the annual meeting of the American Economic Association, and you're all invited. So it's going to be in Philadelphia in January this coming year. And if you're interested in economics, you know folks who are. It's really an amazing convention. It's like 10,000 economists from all over the world who converge on one city for a long weekend, and it's like wild. I'll close with a couple of you might be an economist if jokes. So you might be an economist if you're an expert on money, but you dress like a flood victim. Stole that one from an old Dilbert cartoon. You might be an economist if you think that America's next top model should be a growth model with endogenous technological change. You might be an economist if you don't read human interest stories because they don't interest you. You might be an economist if you have ever gone to a bank or other financial institution in the hopes of getting a date. You plan to have your children born in December instead of January, so that you can maximize the discounted present value of the child tax credit. You might be an economist if you think that supply and demand is a good answer to questions like, where do babies come from? And finally, you might be an economist if you adamantly refuse to sell your children because you think they'll be worth more later. Thank you all for letting me join you this morning. I hope you enjoyed the rest.